So tensions are rising in Belarus after the country's embattled leader, Alexander Lukashenko, held high-stakes talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. They met yesterday in Sochi, where Russia agreed to give Belarus a $1.5 billion loan. Putin urged the country to settle its ongoing political turmoil without foreign interference. He also applauded Lukashenko for vowing to launch constitutional reform. So this comes after weeks of massive protests against Lukashenko's re-election last month, which was widely accused of being rigged and unfair. Around 150,000 people marched through the streets of Belarus over the weekend, demanding the authoritarian leader step down after 26 years in power. So for more on this, let's bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay. He is following the latest from Rome. So Chris, let's start with this meeting between Lukashenko and Putin. What were some of the biggest takeaways? And could we see any major changes moving forward? I think it's interesting that Putin was encouraging encouraging Lukashenko to find a solution without outside interference. But I don't know, a check for over $1 billion seems like pretty hefty outside interference.
That's right, Anne-Marie. And outside interference other than Vladimir Putin, other than Russia, I'm sure that was the subtext, of course. Look, $1.5 billion is a lot of money. It's going to go a long way to paying for these security forces, which, by the way, have been working around the clock ever since these contested elections last month. And they've been very busy, to be quite frank, beating a lot of the protesters and detaining and jailing them. In fact, some of these protesters have even died after their encounters at the hands of riot police, and they need to be paid, and so this money is going to go towards that. As far as other takeaways are concerned, the big question lingers. Will we see Russian security forces cross the border into Belarus to try and quell the violence? The violence, we need to emphasize, has been at the hands of the riot police, at the hands of the government. These protesters have, by and large, been extremely peaceful. They haven't been vandalizing. They haven't been, attacking police. They've been defending themselves from police. But it's very easy to see from so much of the footage and some of our own reporting on the ground that the police have been the aggressors. Vladimir Putin had already vowed to send in security forces if the situation continues to deteriorate, and he affirmed that at this latest meeting. The question is, well, how many security forces and how long would they stick around? And this raises alarm bells for people who remember countries like Ukraine and Georgia, other former Soviet states that also experienced political upheavals in recent years and then found that they had Russian troops not just on their borders, but actually occupying portions of their territory.
What's been remarkable, Chris, as you know, is even as you point to the fact that the authorities have been heavy-handed with the protesters, the numbers have been growing, the numbers have been swelling. So what exactly is Russia's strategy towards Belarus? Does President Putin support Lukashenko, or would the Kremlin like to see him step down to make way for a new leader that could form perhaps closer political ties with?
Yeah, that's right, Vlad. I mean, this violent tactic has totally backfired on Lukashenko. It's only encouraged people, it's motivated and inspired them to turn out in greater and greater numbers. They saw what happened to their friends or their children. I mean, we're not talking just about, young, disgruntled, out-of-work people. I mean, that people are often stereotyped as protesters. We're talking about a broad spectrum of society, rich and poor, old, young. I mean, I've seen nuns and priests out on the streets protesting. And so when you see how much of the public he's really lost, the deck is really stacked against him right now, except for Russia. I mean, that's his backstop. In terms of how Russia actually feels about Lukashenko, I'm sure they would love nothing more than somebody who is better at managing Belarus at this moment. They would take that person if it didn't look like the protesters had won. And that's the big concern for Russia, which is going through its own much smaller protest movement at home. Vladimir Putin is not as popular as he used to be. And the last thing he wants to do is give Russians the impression that this kind of popular protest is effective, especially when it's right on his doorstep. So right now, he's left with very few options. He has to support Lukashenko, whether he likes it or not, at least for the time being.
What about the opposition? And I was trying to quickly look up the woman's name, but I know I'm probably going to mispronounce it. You know, is there a strong enough opposition that these protesters would have someone to get behind, someone to sort of push forward as an alternative?
Sure, Anne-Marie. The person you're referring to is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's a 38-year-old self-described stay-at-home mom who wanted nothing to do with politics. She only got into it when her husband, who was originally running for office, was arrested, and then she felt like it was her responsibility to pick up the baton. She's since had to flee into exile in neighboring Lithuania after it became quite clear that the government in Belarus was threatening not just her life, but her children. It was extremely ominous, and she's been, nevertheless, very engaged ever since then. In fact, yesterday, before this meeting between Putin and Lukashenko, she released a video message in which she was basically calling Vladimir Putin out for meeting with Lukashenko, who didn't actually win the elections, instead of meeting with the people or with her or somebody else from the opposition, which they claim actually did win. In terms of their chances of actually winning power, you know, it seems like a David and Goliath when you look at Lukashenko, who has the power of the military and the security forces, but he really has very little else. I mean, just zoom out and look at the size of these crowds. I mean, at times you've had hundreds of thousands of people, and that's an enormous number in any country, let alone a relatively small one like Belarus, which is fewer than 10 million people. And it's cutting across all spectra of society, as I mentioned, even the public sector, which is the sector that Lukashenko is supposed to control. That includes the military and security forces, some of whom have videotaped themselves taking off their uniforms and saying they can no longer serve this type of leader. So the question about could there be some kind of a palace coup, you know, somebody close to Lukashenko deciding, well, enough is enough, this can go on no longer. I think that's the biggest hope of protesters, and I think it's one of the reasons why they keep turning out day after day, week after week. They don't feel at all that their chances are small.
And Chris, before we let you go, Putin may be uneasy about these massive protests in Belarus because, as you've been pointing out, it could energize anti-government demonstrations in Russia. And certainly that could be problematic. So one of the country's top opposition leaders, Alexei Navalny, is still recovering from an apparent poison attack. Bring us up to speed.
Yes, the plot thickens with Alexei Navalny, Russia's fiercest dissident who drank some poison tea, he says, and scientists around Germany and the rest of Europe have sampled this poison inside of his system and confirmed it was Novichok. That's a Soviet-era poison. So all signs point towards the government of Russia being involved in his poisoning, something, of course, that Russia denies. If they tried to kill him, it didn't work. He was in a medically induced coma for weeks, and he's just come out of it, posting today for the very first time on Instagram that he's now breathing on his own, using a little bit of humor, saying that breathing on its own is something he highly recommends. And he's also said that he wants to go back to Russia, which was probably very unwelcome news for Russia, which brushed it off and said that as a Russian citizen, he's welcome to do so anytime he wants. Vlad?
Important reporting there. Chris Livesay, thank you as always, my friend. We appreciate it.